I want to thank Michael for putting me on the list to be here today. I've mentioned to him beforehand the last time I had something official to do on these grounds was, I think, 1969 when I sang at an Easter Vigil service over at the Basilica. My music teacher in high school, I grew up in PG County, and I had a music teacher who was the cantor here. And I got to sing in a lot of special services and concerts. So I will not sing today. I come at this assignment from a little bit different perspective. As you heard from my biographical sketch, I'm not in the academy, although I hang out with scholars most of the time. And a lot of what I do is to try to popularize work that is typically not read by a lot of generalist lay people. And I tend to look at books as, yes, they're achievements of great scholarship, but they're also a story. I'm a journalist at heart. And so I'm looking for who has a book that's an interesting story that will particularly assist Christians in understanding the culture that they live in. And one of the things I'm very interested in is the question of the kinds of practices in the life of the church that will help reshape our imaginations so that we perceive reality properly. And I've been interested for a long time in the question of how mechanical metaphors shape our perception of reality. So I was that aspect of Michael's book was very compelling. What I'd like to do is encourage Michael to think, and the final remarks we just heard are along the same line, to consider how he might establish sympathetic resonance with other thinkers who've been raising questions, not just in philosophical theology and not just concerning God and creation, but and even perhaps with people outside the Christian tradition who are raising questions about the inadequacy of a mechanistic model to explain reality, and particularly to explain human experience. And there are a host of, as we all know, there are a host of settings in which that kind of conversation is necessary. Just yesterday I was reading an article about the transhumanists, those who talk about participatory evolution, human nature 2.0, who basically say we can do a better job than God did at engineering human nature because we have better technology than God did, I guess. Again, there are lots of social and political challenges raised by these kinds of agendas, all of which are rooted in an assumption about our essentially mechanistic nature. In an essay that Michael wrote in the book Being Holy in the World, which was a book looking at David L. Schindler's work, Michael wrote a piece in there called Beyond Mechanism. And in that, he talked about the mechanistic ontology of modernity is presupposed, analogously manifest, and juridically enforced throughout the various spheres of liberal society. And I think that the extent to which that's the case makes Michael's book foundational, not just for thinking about theology of creation and thinking about Darwin or even biology, but far beyond that. In the beginning of his book, he indicates that he hopes scientists will be one of the audiences for it. Scientists, quote, whose wonder and whose sincere desire to get to the bottom of things leads them beyond the positivism and empiricism of their own training and into a good faith, though not necessarily agreeable, engagement with metaphysics and theology. I really want to meet those scientists also. And I have a friend who's a research scientist in biophysics who, I have to confess, told me he tried to read Michael's book and had a hard time with it. And I think that a part of the task that's necessary beyond Michael's book is to figure out how to make connections. Particularly, scientists no longer think of themselves as natural philosophers. They're typically advanced technicians. That condition itself is something that is a pastoral problem, I think, in the life of the church. The assumption that the relationship of science with metaphysics and theology is an extrinsic one is so deeply ingrained in the imaginations both of scientists and lay people. And significantly, that extrinsicism is institutionally patrolled by powerful political and economic forces. It's hard to get a grant to do scientific research that isn't mechanistic and that doesn't have some sort of patentable process at the end of the project. I guess one question I would like Michael to answer is why he chose the word science rather than sciences in the title of the book. Because I do think that our regarding of science as a unitary thing, referring to science rather than the sciences, I think has at least as much to do with economic and political forces as it does with 17th century dreams of an omnicompetent system. And the positivism and empiricism that dominates the training of sciences serves as much a vision of the national interest or GDP as it does the interest of knowledge itself. Power, not wisdom or love, is recognizable as a public goal, and unfortunately, scientists are necessarily beholden to that vision. And Michael's book helps us understand how this barbaric condition is a function of a faulty understanding of a God and creation. We understand ourselves as manipulative alien engineers because that's how we imagine God. One of the things I'd like to do is to bring some other voices into conversation with Michael's book, voices that have gained a bit of public traction, although voices that are sometimes dismissed as romantic and irrelevant and impractical. As I was reading Michael's book, several points I thought of a short book by Wendell Berry called Life is a Miracle, in which he writes, the most radical influence of reductive science has been the virtually universal adoption of the idea that the world, its creatures, and all the parts of its creatures are machines. That is, that there is no difference between creature and artifice, birth and manufacture, thought and computation. Our language, wherever it is used, is now almost invariably conditioned by the assumption that fleshly bodies are machines full of mechanisms, fully compatible with the mechanisms of medicine, industry, and commerce, and that minds are computers fully compatible with electronic technology. Berry says that this started as a metaphor, but the language that it's used now, it's evolved from metaphor to identification. And then he points out this usage institutionalizes the human wish or the sin of wishing, that life might be or might be made to be predictable. If we imagine the world to be a machine, it means that we might have the capacity to re-engineer and hence control it. And as the great modern project it focuses so much attention on expanding human control, to reimagine human life in mechanical terms is a way of enabling and legitimizing that project. Now, people often accuse Wendell Berry of irresponsible hyperbole, and shortly after I read Life is a Miracle, I stumbled across a book called Flesh and Machines, How Robots Will Change Us. This is written before the idea of dating your robot actually is now on the radar, but this is from 2002. A robotics guru, Rodney Brooks, who was then director of Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT, he's now the Panasonic Professor of Robotics Emeritus at MIT. And Brooks wrote, "We are nothing more than a highly ordered collection of biomolecules. The body, this mass of biomolecules, is a machine that acts according to a set of specifiable rules." And later he writes in a spurt of vicious anti-sentimentality, "We are machines, as are our spouses, our children, and our dogs." Now, why he doesn't mention cats is an interesting question. And then later, we all of us over-anthropomorphize humans. I'm reminded an engineer friend, when he found out I'd named my computer, says, "Oh, you shouldn't anthropomorphize computers. They hate that." Now this is a brutally brave assertion, and Berry addresses it. He says, "The language we use to speak of the world and its creatures, including ourselves, has gained a certain analytic power along with a lot of expertish pomp. but has lost much of its power to designate what is being analyzed or to convey any respect or care or affection or devotion toward it. There's something ironic about Brooks's reductionistic effort to get to the bottom of biomolecules and the allegedly simple mechanical nature of their functioning, because beneath the biology there is physics. And since the middle of the last century, the last thing that physicists have been eager to do is to explain what happens at the most fundamental level of physical processes in terms of simple machines. Stephen Talbot, in his book Devices of the Soul, notes that for at least 60 years, quote, the entire movement of physics has been away from concrete machine models, and indeed away from models altogether. And Talbot argues if you really want to be a reductionist, and you want to reduce higher things to their lowest level, quote, then you need to start with whatever is at the bottom. Your primary explanatory apparatus, in other words, is quantum weirdness. And the one place in science where you absolutely cannot find a machine is amidst the scarcely utterable perplexity of the quantum realm. Now, another voice I thought of in reading this, the past year I did a lot of reading in the work of Owen Barfield, who, saving the appearances, a phrase that is in Michael's book, a book that Barfield is known for. Barfield, as you probably know, was a good friend of C.S. Lewis's. Lewis describes him in Surprised by Joy as the second friend, that the first friend is just like you, it sees the world you do, and the second friend is the person who's read all the right books and drawn all the wrong conclusions, like someone who speaks your language but mispronounces most of the words. And but he had a lifelong relationship with Barfield, and Barfield actually outlived him quite a long time. Barfield died only in 1999, lived to be 98 or 99 years old. Barfield was raising questions about mechanism quite early on, and Lewis, although Lewis disagreed with Barfield in many points, there's a fascinating passage in The Abolition of Man, which is probably Lewis's most important book that deals with questions about reductionistic science. It's a fascinating homage to Barfield that I'd read The Abolition of Man, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 times and never noticed this little reference, and I should have noticed it. It's in the last chapter where Lewis talks about how science needs to become more repentant, and how science, how science and Renaissance magic had a lot in common. That for a pre-modern man, he says the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality. For magic and applied science alike, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men. The solution is a technique, and both in practice of this technique are ready to do things hitherto regarded as disgusting and impious. And then later in that paragraph, he says, no doubt those who really founded modern science were usually those whose love of truth exceeded their love of power. In every mixed movement, the efficacy comes from the good elements, not from the bad. But the presence of the bad elements is not irrelevant to the direction the efficacy takes. It might be going too far to say the modern scientific movement was tainted from its birth, but I think it would be true to say it was born in an unhealthy neighborhood and an inauspicious hour. Its triumphs may have been too rapid and purchased at too high a price. Reconsideration and something like repentance may be required. And that phrase has stuck with me for a long time. What would repentance for science involve, practically speaking? What kind of form might that take? And then the allusion to Barfield and Barfield's influence. Is it then possible to imagine a new natural philosophy, continually conscious that the natural object produced by analysis and abstraction is not reality but only a view, and always correcting the abstraction? And then one of the most tentative statements I think Lewis ever made, I hardly know what I am asking for, he writes. I hear rumors that Goethe's approach to nature deserves fuller consideration, that even Dr. Steiner may have seen something that orthodox researchers have missed. And the Dr. Steiner here is Rudolf Steiner, who was point of reference for much of Barfield's work, the founder of the movement or school called anthroposophy. And Barfield found in Steiner's thought a continuation and development of the ideas that he'd seen in Goethe and also in Coleridge. Ideas about how a proper engagement with nature required the exercise of a sympathetic imagination, not just a pragmatic reduction of all of reality to manipulable material cause and effect. That is, that we, in a sense, participate in nature as we understand it, not just stand in an allegedly detached way. As I said, this is one of the most tentative passages in all of Lewis's writings, and his perplexity about where to find a better path for science. He ends up falling back on resources that Barfield had recommended, even though he was suspicious of Steiner and of the effort to infuse scientific enterprise with imagination. I think that's part of actually what a repentant science might require. Barfield wrote a book, an essay in the Saturday Evening Post. The good old days when supermarket magazines had articles about ontology and metaphysics. It was called The Rediscovery of Meaning, and it's probably the most accessible piece of writing by Barfield, and revealed a concern he had about the widespread unease in the 20th century about a growing general sense of meaninglessness. And as he summarized it for the readers of the Saturday Evening Post, most people are well aware with the advent of the scientific revolution that the mind of man began to relate itself to the world around it in an entirely new way. The habit then first arose of meticulously observing the facts of nature, systematically interpreting them in terms of physical cause and effect. This habit has been growing ever since with incalculable and largely beneficial results for the accumulation of practical knowledge, or knowledge enabling the manipulation of nature. What is less clearly realized is the precise nature and significance of a certain further step which was taken in the 19th century. It was then that this habitual practice in the pursuit of knowledge was formulated as a dogma under the name of positive philosophy or positivism. And then Barfield goes on to explain positivism to the readers of the Saturday Evening Post, pointing out that the habit of attending to physical cause and effect and becoming deliberately inattentive to any realities beyond physical cause and effect gave rise to an assumption that scientific attention to the meaning, quote, as distinct from the causes of phenomena was impossible. Scientific attention to the meaning as distinct from the causes of phenomena was impossible. Barfield didn't think that science needed to have taken that step. That one actually could imagine a science that actually attended to the meaning, particularly the meaning of organism. Barfield said that there was a kind of dualistic détente that was possible whereby the world of the senses, the world known by scientific knowledge, was acknowledged as mechanical and devoid of meaning, but we could preserve an inner life for human beings as a zone of meaning and purpose, but it was an uneasy state of affairs that could not be sustained. And I think we've seen since Barfield wrote this that the increasing difficulty of sustaining that kind of détente. And the latter part of Barfield's article, he was looking at thinkers who rejected mechanistic and dualistic models. And this is something that I think would be an interesting sequel to Michael's book. I'm not telling him that he needs to write this and spend the next 15 years. But it would be fascinating to see. There are allusions in the book to some thinkers, some of them marginalized, who weren't part of this mainstream since the 19th century, but thinkers like Goethe and Coleridge, who did, Goethe being a very significant botanist in his day, wrote also a book on color theory. And Goethe believed that scientists should attend to the qualities of objects that we're observing, not just measurable, quantifiable attributes. Science could be concerned with an engagement with the meaning of things, not just the detached analysis of things for the sake of control. And I'd be interested to see if Michael thinks that this kind of approach to science, to a kind of repentant science, would be one of the consequences of recovering an alternative to a mechanistic ontology, and that sees an ontology whereby creation is understood as participating in the life of God in some way. I want to close just with a few references to a thinker that's been a contemporary thinker who has collected a lot of work on biological research. Some of you may know the name Stephen Talbot. He has been writing in the last several years for a journal called The New Atlantis. He talks about Goethean science and talks about a science of qualities. And I was fascinated. In fact, I sent some of your essays to him. I don't know if he's gotten in touch with you.
No, but I've been meaning to get in touch with him.
Well, I sent, and he said, I wish I'd written that. Again, he's not writing from a point of view of metaphysics, but well, at least not explicitly, and it's certainly not the theological metaphysics. Again, a thinker who has tried to rally the work of biologists who are resisting the mechanistic kind of reductionism. In an essay he wrote in 2007 in the New Atlantis called Ghosts in the Evolutionary Machinery, he actually repeats a warning from Barfield that our pursuit of materialism will paradoxically estrange us from concrete material reality. It's a paradox that that Barfield was quite aware of, and this is actually in an essay that Talbot has written about digital organisms that are apparently a tool of a lot of evolutionary research. That is, we want to figure out how changes happen and how organisms evolve and acquire new capacities, and so they basically develop algorithms that can change and apparently learn. And but as Talbot argues in this article, there are no things there. There are formulae that evolve in some way, but that actually concrete things, and particularly concrete things that are organisms, are lost sight of. As he writes here, the world that we know is a world of specific character, of particular insistent presences, of expressive qualities. A world of smiling faces, fluttering leaves, stretching cats, billowing clouds. In turning away from these presences, from these qualities, in seeking the denatured, inert, non-experienceable stuff of the scientist's abstract imagination, we turn away from the one reality we are given. It is only natural, then, that direct and careful observation of the world's vivid, many-faceted character should yield more and more to one-dimensional measurement. He, interestingly, has the same critique of the intelligent design movement that you do also.
I just read that.
I mentioned that he's been trying to, that Talbot, and he works for an institution called the Nature Institute. And they are publishing sporadically. They recently reprinted portions of a work of biology in 1930 by E.S. Russell called The Interpretation of Development and Heredity, a Study in Biological Method. And this is fascinating to me, again, as an outsider to this discipline, that the questions that have been more recently raised in developmental evolution were questions that were being raised as early as 1930, particularly looking at the kind of at the inadequacy of mechanistic models, and how in organisms the whole often determines the parts. That organisms are such that that organisms have exert a kind of formal cause on their parts. Talbot himself wrote an essay called Rediscovering Life. This is relatively recent. In fact, this came out just last April. Biology's, I think I read this about the time I was reading your book, Biology's Shameful Refusal to Disown the Machine Organism. That is, he thinks that there's so much evidence that the mechanistic model is just not describing what actually is happening in organisms, that the fact that they continue to use that vocabulary is, he says, shameful. The examples he gives, and if I could share just a concrete example here, of a way in which the whole of an organism shapes the part of an organism. He has details of a zygote proceeding through its development. He says, as a fertilized egg proceeds through its development, no alien hand reaches in to adjust the form of the cytoskeleton or the relations between the nucleus or other organelles or the permeability of various membranes. He's earlier said that mechanisms are assembled. Mechanisms involve alien hands who manipulate parts. But in the case of an organism, there is no alien hand. There are, in fact, no fixed parts to adjust. A small clump of cells here or there metamorphoses into a forelimb or a heart or liver. Actually, this description is still too thing-like. Structures result, first of all, from movement and flows. And he quotes a biologist here who describes what happens as the heart begins to develop in a zygote. The body does not behave like a plumber, first connecting the water pipes in a house and then turning the water on. The first blood-like liquid simply trickles through gaps in tissues. Preferred channels develop only gradually as blood cells are deposited along the edges, eventually merge into the beginnings of vessel walls. Similarly, the walls separating the four chambers of our hearts are already there before they exist as solid structures. At first, they're simply still water zones between distinct looping currents of blood, and only later do the walls materialize, taking their shape from those already structured flows. No artificial heart is built this way. The whole of the organism is there from the beginning. Then there's a real sense in which it's the whole that makes the parts. The whole is dynamic, a bearer and realizer of unseen potentials. It works upon itself in the process of differentiation, maintaining its unity all along the way, then gathering its dynamic powers, bringing them to a focus in the intensely potentiated gamete, representing both a continuation and dramatic renewal of life. So again, I think there are a lot of encouraging signs that actually the reality is better than the theories that have captivated biologists, and biologists are increasingly seeing this, and particularly the inadequacy of a mechanistic model. I'll mention one. I won't cite it, or won't quote from it, but Talbot has an essay called "What Do Organisms Mean?", which was part of a series he was writing for the New Atlantis. It came out in in 2011 in the winter 2011 issue, and all of these are available online if you'd like to look at it. So again, I find this encouraging. I find that unfortunately Talbot's work and the work of many others doesn't have a theoretical framework or a philosophical framework, metaphysical framework to account for these things. And that's why I think that Michael has written a book that could be remarkably foundational and seminal. I think the task for somebody, not necessarily for him, is to figure out how do you build on this, and how do you build particularly institutional longevity, so that scientists, particularly young research scientists, are encouraged to start asking questions about metaphysics early in their careers rather than when they're ready to retire. I spoke to a group of graduate students at UVA last year, and I actually brought your book along and started raising questions, and I could see, the fear in their eyes already that they're either their dissertation advisor would think they're crazy, or if they graduated, they'd never get tenure if they started asking these kinds of questions. So I think the challenge is to figure out how do you institutionalize the shaping of imagination of new generations of scientists who then have the capacity to apply within their work the real structure of reality that's present in the Christian understanding of the nature of creation. So thank you again, Michael.